Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to try to think about Finnegans Wake philosophically using the theory of Gilles Deleuze in his essay collection, Two Regimes of Madness. This is his final essay collection, and what interests me so much about Deleuze is that compared to his contemporaries like Derrida or Lacan, Deleuze doesn't really talk about Joyce that much comparatively. And yet I think that Deleuze's philosophy and his commentary on other philosophers and thinkers more broadly is probably the most apt for understanding Finnegans Wake and Joyce's pragmatics, his style, his politics, and his philosophy. So I'm going to be using some of the selections from this roughly 400-page essay collection, kind of picking and choosing, in order to help accentuate Finnegans Wake and dig deep into its pragmatics of concepts. Because that's what Deleuze's philosophy is all about, a pragmatics of concepts, where we come out of the ideal and we come down to an immanent domain of shifting entities with no ultimate ground. All they have is their erring, without a center to ground them. And yet, there are localized, liminal senses of stability. And this sense of homogeneity that we might think, for example, defines language, that it has some sort of essential consistency, is in actual fact just a contingent resultant. It's not some sort of grounded principle for Deleuze. So he is trying to understand how do things err, and how can this errance, or this deterritorialization, as he and Guattari would put it, how can this be turned into something which is fuel for creativity? In his essay, The Future of Linguistics, Deleuze says that some linguists are beginning to doubt the informational character of language in general. Which is to say that before it had been assumed that language was about delivering information, that it was about communicating some sort of essence packed inside the original utterance, and the job of the receiver is merely to try to take account of all the distortions that happen in the communication process and ameliorate them or make up for them. But in fact, Deleuze wants to go away from this sort of classical notion of language and see it as something more than informational. That, for example, it is also affective, which is to say that it delivers sensations in a way that supersedes a logic that is merely going to reduce language to concrete packs of information. Contrary to this, Deleuze wants to see language as a series of flows, and flows which constitute, as he says, a genuine pragmatics or politics, which draws out the assemblages of power at work in a particular language, as well as the linguistic possibilities of struggle against these powers. And these linguists that he speaks of are challenging the idea of the structural homogeneity of a particular language and the idea of universals of language. So once again, going away from that grounded conception of language towards one which is eminently political and struggles. And this struggle can be really epitomized in a passage that I think is extremely relevant for Finnegans Wake, when he says languages are gibberish, Joycean quirks. They're not anchored to structures. It is only functions and movements that manage to create a bit of polemical order in them. Gobard is right, because as soon as you have something to say, you're like a foreigner in your native language. And this idea of the foreigner we know is really important for Joyce because Joyce was an exile. He was an expat willingly from his own country because of the conservatism and the extreme nationalism which he saw as perpetuating its own form of bigotry. And he wants to go against this, Joyce does, in his very linguistic practice, showing that languages are not, the exception is not gibberish, but they are constituted at their very core by gibberish, by what I might call a gibberishing, by an act of nonsense, such that languages aren't grounded in some notion of sense, but the fact that part of it always slips away as nonsense, that it's not anchored in structures, but that rather structures are polemical order, which is to say they are rhetorically inflected creations after the fact used to impose some sort of homogeneity. So any homogeneity that we see in language for Deleuze is a result of power. It doesn't precede power. As such, he says that Gobard, this linguist that he's talking about, has another question in mind: how to stammer. Not to stammer words in speech or in a particular language, but how to stammer language in general. And I think this is the really prompting question behind Finnegans Wake. How to make language err, not on its peripheries, as if we're just going outwards and showing that the center of language that is most policed is the most stable. No, it's by showing that that which is most policed, that which appears the most homogeneous, is in fact not so homogeneous. And in fact, it is always threatened by errance and by exile. And Joyce wants to sort of creatively impose that exile as a dynamic driving force of narrative, of character, of concept, of form, and of style. And I think in Deleuze's essay Desire and Pleasure, I think it's really apt when he speaks of creating a plane of immanence where there are only degrees of speed and slowness, no development, and everything is seen and heard. It is a dreamlike war machine. This could very well be talking about Finnegans Wake. And what's really interesting here is that he says there is no development. Because in a sense, nothing happens in Finnegans Wake. Everything has either already happened, or all happenings are a sort of mirage, such that they're not the full unfolding of some pre-made intentionality of a character or an author. Instead, we get varying degrees of speeds and slownesses, of a sort of oscillation in rhythm, where there is not deployment, there's not progression towards some telos, or regression away from that telos, but rather digression, a digressive capacity of language itself. In his essay, Making Inaudible Forces Audible, Deleuze talks a lot about how music can be applicable to philosophy and literature. And he speaks of a non-pulsed time. And this is coming from Pierre Boulez, who is trying to come up with some notion of rhythm that is not constrained by meter, which is to say, a relative sense of pulse and of a sort of gestational quality that isn't overridden by some sort of metric matrix, which is going to restrict the possibility of enunciations within a musical piece. As such, Deleuze speaks of a floating time, duration, or time freed from measure. This idea of duration, or durée, in Boulez, is a sort of non-pulsed time that puts us first and foremost in the presence of a multiplicity of heterochronous, qualitative, non-coincident, non-communicating durations. And this to me is the very essence of character, of plot, of setting in Finnegans Wake, right? You have a relation between elements, just like you have between note values in music, for example. But it is multiplicitous. It speaks of multiple times. Literally think about how Finnegans Wake is hearkening all the way back to the beginning of human history and of non-human history, of the beginning of the universe, and all the way up through successive literary periods and to his own contemporary day, and speaking to the future, to the ability to wake, to rise up. I think of how Joyce often uses the imagery of the phoenix to sort of simulate this contradictory sleeping and waking duality that constitutes the possibility space of every utterance. So this is literally speaking in and through and by different times, hence heterochronos. And then it's non-coincident because things overlap, but they don't form some sort of synchronous unity. There's always a sense of dissynchronicity that sort of effectuates change, keeps anything from being said for the last time or being said too concretely. And they're non-communicating. I think this is one of the real problems psychologically for the characters and the author of Finnegans Wake, is the problem of communication. That it's very hard for us to speak to each other because we speak in different tongues, and even when we think we're speaking in the same tongue, we in fact really are speaking in different tongues every time we utter anything. Deleuze says that the motifs in Wagner are not only associated with an outside character, they change, have an autonomous life in a non-pulsed floating time, where they themselves and by themselves become characters inside the music. Because in Wagner, we see that motifs are attached to characters to signal characters, to, in a way, act as a communicative, significatory act, But they also take on an autonomy because they get reduced and affected by a theme and variations style that really does away with the idea that any is an original instantiation of that motif. For example, you have the sword motif, one of the most common motifs in Wagner's music and one of the most famous that's associated with him. And that motif, we see it chronologically uttered a first time in his oeuvre, and yet nevertheless it goes through so many qualitative changes that we can't really presume that the original is the most authentic. Each one of them is a chance to follow the character progressing, such that we don't teleologically assume that either the oldest or youngest instantiation of that theme, and thereby of that character's mentality and mindset, is the best. It's merely a sense of digression, where motifs constantly expand and open up the possibility space for a number of unexpected changes. And I think Deleuze is especially apt for understanding the polyvocality of Finnegans Wake, because in his letter to Uno on language, he says that, in my view, every utterance is composed of several voices, which is to say, every singular utterance is actually multiplicitous. It speaks for a variety of voices, a variety of different discourses, of expectations, of conflicting agencies. We know this from Freud, for example, where the id, ego, and superego are multiplicitous aspects of this thing we call the self, and they are composing actively the self all the time, and they're also threatening it. I think this is really crucial. Deleuze says language is never a homogeneous system, nor does it contain such systems. Language is always a heterogeneous system, or as physicists say, a system far from equilibrium. Now this is important, because not only does he say that language is never a homogeneous system, but also that it doesn't even contain them. And this is important. Between every utterance, Deleuze wants to insist on an irremediable amount of difference. This is the reason that we can understand one utterance as distinct from another one. Even if it's a repetition, say, of a continuous syllable, the fact that we can count them and differentiate them from another means that they take on a difference temporally, for example, or there's a slight differentiation in tone or in rhythm or in volume. All of these are ways by which Deleuze, going to the micro level, and Finnegans Wake is all about the micro level, shows that language is always heterogeneous, always expanding, far from any equilibrium point. It is always erring away from a void at the heart of it, as Joyce would say, the void of to be, right? That being itself is a sort of void, or as Heidegger would say, an ungrund, an unground, that allows for and in fact demands the constant dissemination of signification. As such, Deleuze says literature is writing far from equilibrium, writing in one's own language as in a foreign language. And he mentions Proust and Kafka here, but I think Joyce would be the perfect example here, because Joyce is writing his own language, which is to say creating his own language, composing his own language. As in a foreign language, we always get the sense that we are the foreigner in Finnegans Wake, in addition to the characters. But also, he's doing this in such a way that language itself becomes foreign to itself, that it is far from its own supposed equilibrium. So counter to the agencies bred into language, Deleuze wants to insist on an errance, that as he says, the ruptures belong to the method. I think this is the perfect descriptor for Finnegans Wake, that it is constituted by discontinuity, by lacuna, by gaps, by kinks in this circle of history. In his essay Zones of Immanence, Deleuze says, whatever the theoretical comprises, something in the proliferations of immanence tends to overtake the vertical world, to reverse it, as if the hierarchy bred a particular anarchy, and the love of God an internal atheism proper to it. Heresy is flirted with every time. And I think this is especially interesting for understanding the sort of counter-theology, the counter-gospel of Finnegans Wake. I think of the line, perdition stinks before us, where Joyce is really facing up to this idea of being preterite, of being fallen or condemned to walk along the earth like an insect. As we see, for example, the siglum of HCE is an E turned on its feet like an insect crawling along the ground. This gives it its own unique anarchistic immanence that Deleuze is really helpful for understanding. There is an internal depravity, excess, and anarchy that really speaks to Joyce's sort of Pentecostal blabbering that we see in Finnegans Wake. It is a joyful science, right? A fröhliche Wissenschaft, as Nietzsche would put it. Returning to Boulez, in Deleuze's essay Occupy Without Counting, Boulez, Proust, and Time, he speaks of this concept of blocks or bubbles of time. And this is what linguistic and musical utterances are for Deleuze. He says that these blocks, or these bubbles, lead to a general rejection of any principle of identity and the variations and distributions that define them. That variations are constant, right? Movement and dynamism is the norm. Stasis is death. And stasis is only relative, because really there is no absolute stasis. There only is the appearance of, for example, a still corpse relative to our moving bodies. But in fact, the particles which make it up are teeming with, at the very least, Brownian motion, if not the motion of microorganisms and whatnot. So there's a general rejection of any idea that being must be preceded by essence. Rather, essence proceeds from an immanent erring and multiplicity. Deleuze says, this does not mean that the involuntary memory or the fixed reestablishes a principle of identity. Right? This is a sort of liminal notion of memory, of a fixity relative to other things that is not absolute. Proust, like Joyce and Faulkner, is one of those who dismissed any principle of identity from literature. Even in repetition, the fixed is not defined by the identity of a repeated element, but by a quality common to elements that would not be repeated without it. For example, the famous taste common to two moments, or in a music, a common pitch. This is really interesting, right? We have repetition founded upon a differentiation, not only from without, but as Deleuze says in Difference in Repetition, a differentiation, that's spelled with a C, which is internal to an utterance itself. A tendency not to err and differ as a result of assault coming from without, but a dynamism bred within. A repetition that can at best establish common qualities relative to local elements around it. Now, this section in Deleuze's essay, What is the Creative Act, is actually recorded, and you can find it on YouTube. And coming back and actually reading it after having read Finnegans Wake many times, I now realize the aptness for using it to understand the dream style of Finnegans Wake. He says that the dream of those who are dreaming concerns those who are not dreaming. Why does it concern them? Because as soon as someone else dreams, there's danger. People's dreams are always all-consuming and threaten to devour us. What other people dream is very dangerous. Dreams are a terrifying will to power. Each of us is more or less a victim of other people's dreams. Even the most graceful young woman is a horrific ravager, not because of her soul, but because of her dreams. Beware of the dreams of others, because if you are caught in their dreams, you're done for. And when Deleuze is speaking about dreams as a terrifying will to power, this strikes me as similar but notably different from Freud's idea of dreams as wish fulfillment. Because for Freud, every dream is secretly a fulfillment of a wish. And of whose wish? Well, really Oedipus's wish. And really, Deleuze would say Freud's wish. It is the wish of the analyst who imposes a static framework onto a multiplicitous mind and attempts to reel it in, to rest it, and really not allow it to speak for itself. As such, dreams speak for an other. This reminds me of Lacan saying that language is always the other's discourse, right? It always speaks to and for something which we are not. And therefore, it shows this fundamental erring quality at the heart of ourselves, which is to say that at the heart of ourselves is something which is not ourselves, that we are not solidly constituted at the center. And this is the very same for Finnegans Wake, right? There is not some sort of solid core, but rather all we have is the errors. All we have is the mood-merry cycle-wheeling history, the vicocyclometer, as Joyce calls it in Finnegans Wake. And perhaps one of the most interesting essays in this collection is Deleuze's essay, What Voice Brings to the Text. And this seems really pertinent considering the vocality and the performativity of Finnegans Wake. It's commonly known that Joyce recited part of the Anna Livia Pluribel chapter, and you can find a recording of it on YouTube, on Spotify, on a number of different platforms. And people have commonly said that after listening to that recording, they understood Finnegans Wake a considerable bit better. And I think that's because Finnegans Wake fundamentally harkens to and demands a vocal, an audible, a sonic register. And Deleuze really wants to latch on to that sonic register because it shows the variability and the dynamism of utterances, of signification. He says that concepts have speeds and slownesses, movements, dynamics that expand and contract throughout the text. They no longer correspond to characters, but are characters themselves, rhythmic characters. They fulfill each other or separate, clash, or hug like wrestlers or lovers. The actor's voice traces these rhythms, these movements of the mind in space and time. The actor is the operator of the text. He or she operates a dramatization of the concept, the most precise, the most sober, and the most linear. Right, so we have this idea that performance imposes something on the text, but it also allows for a sort of liminal evocation of the rhythmic nature of the work itself. The voice is a way of anatomically and physically enacting this expansion and contraction, right? This eating, shitting, fucking that they talk about at the beginning of Anti-Oedipus. Deleuze says that the voice reveals that concepts are not abstract. Concepts cut up and combine the things corresponding to them in various and always new ways. They cannot be distinguished from a way of perceiving things. A concept forces us to see things differently, right? Not because it gives us new information, but because it provides us a new framework, a new frame itself, and a new framing of things which already existed. This is why, for Finnegans Wake, I think that form oftentimes overrides content, because the form itself gives us the sense of depth, of expansion, of dynamism, of clashing. Furthermore, Deleuze says, concepts are also inseparable from affects, from new manners of seeing, an entire pathos, joy and anger that form that feelings of thought as such. This philosophical trinity, concept, percept, affect, animates the text. It is up to the actor's voice to bring forth the new perceptions and new affects that surround the read and spoken concept. And I think for Finnegans Wake, we really cannot think of its concepts without reading them and speaking them. And that reading is adopting a spoken voice. It is adopting, for example, the supposed legitimating voice of the artist, which we invoke and use to ground our interpretations. And therefore, Joyce's trinity of concept, percept, affect is really interesting because it foregrounds that textuality is beyond communication, but it is a much broader dynamic enterprise by which to really give us new ways of seeing, and new ways of seeing that are not abstract, not ideal, but rather are eminently political and material. Deleuze has a whole essay in here where he talks about Foucault's concept of a dispositif, an apparatus. And I think this is a very apt way for thinking about Finnegans Wake. He says that a dispositif is a multilinear whole. The lines in the dispositif do not encircle or surround systems that are each homogeneous in themselves, the object, the subject, or language, but follow directions, trace processes that are always out of balance, that sometimes move closer together and sometimes further away. Each line is broken, subject to changes in direction, bifurcating and forked, and subjected to derivations. Visible objects, articulable utterances, forces in use, subjects in positions are like vectors or tensors. Right? And a vector is very interesting because this is a concept coming from physics that Deleuze uses a lot, which has velocity and direction. So not only does it have an intensive quality of its velocity, of how fast is it going, but it has an extensive quality of relating to other things spatially through a direction. And this direction is not some sort of mere progression. it's a dissemination outward into n dimensions, as Deleuze will put it. So this is the concept of multilinearity for Deleuze, that something is always moving further away through derivations. And this concept of derivation is very similar to Derrida's concept of dissemination, that language always, through its sort of general notion of différance, it specifically disseminates outwards beyond any one locus into new domains, and therefore repeats itself, and in that process changes from itself without ever being itself. These are, as Deleuze says, chains of variables that are torn from each other, that we always find a new dimension or a line in crisis, and that great thinkers, Deleuze says, are somewhat seismic. They do not evolve, but proceed by crises or quakes. And I think of the line in Finnegans Wake where he says something like clots of clarinet, Finnegans Quake. He's playing on lots of fun at Finnegans Wake. And I know the first part of that I said is wrong. But the Finnegans Quake, I know he uses that. So there's an interesting sense in which Joyce understood the seismic nature of his work, of every revolutionary piece of literature, which is a quake, a crisis internal to a system, not coming from without, as we've said before. It is a line of fissure or fracture, as Deleuze says. It is, as Foucault would say, a discontinuity. Finally, I think Deleuze has some really good stuff to say in his preface, A New Stylistics. He says, every verb undoubtedly contains dynamisms or special trajectories on which its tenses and modes set up positions and effect cuts. The variables thus traverse zones of variation, which are finite or infinite, continuous or discontinuous, and which constitute style as a modulation of language. Style, he says, is the form actualized in linguistic material. It is a mold. And a mold does not just form a surface or outer layer. It informs the whole of whatever it forms, right? So it acts inwardly upon the very core of what we claim is acting as the homogeneous center. This is no mere mold, Deleuze says. It is a modulation. In other words, it is a mold with a temporal transformation and an internal action. This is going back to that idea of vectors. And Finnegans Wake is very self-aware of this. It talks about there being no such thing as noun in active nature on page 523. So I really think that Deleuze is challenging us to think not simply of Finnegans Wake, but all of language as a modulatory manifold. Because I agree with Gabriel Rengley here, who says that in a very particular sense, Finnegans Wake is not an exemplary text. It is like all other language, just turned up a few notches. It simply accentuates processes of erring, derivation, and dissemination that are present in every single significatory act. Thus, Deleuze is really challenging us through thinking of very dense literature and philosophy and music and art in this philosophical way. He's challenging us to think of the entire world in this broad way. And I think that is the cosmic perspective that Deleuze and Guattari constantly invoke, and that I think Finnegans Wake is really challenging us to approach. So that being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting in thinking about these concepts. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really means a lot to me when you all donate. It helps me buy the books necessary to provide you content, but no worries, care for yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.